Okay, welcome back. And today we're going to do, this is like the noontime lecture on Wednesday, I think maybe the 11th. And I'm doing the lecture on printmaking for today, which is Unit 7, and it's the art medium lecture for Unit 7. It's the second lecture generally for Unit 7. I just did a lecture on the end of the Baroque, like the second half of the Baroque, how that leads into the Rococo, how that leads into Neoclassicism, and then finally kind of ending with the Enlightenment and talking a little bit about was there any kind of specific art for the Age of the Enlightenment. And perhaps there would have been if we hadn't had Romanticism, but Romanticism kind of changed the direction of things quite dramatically. Um, so let's start first by just kind of defining what printmaking is. So, because printmaking is a little bit confusing to students. Like generally, when I do a lecture on drawing or do a lecture on painting or even sculpture, like I don't have to like just go all the way back to the basics of saying, well, what is it? Right? Because we can like talk about how the definitions are a little bit porous and how there might be some examples of drawing that are a little bit like, is it a drawing or is it a painting? Is it a drawing or is it a work of sculpture? But with printmaking, a lot of students may not have ever in their life thought about what is a print, how is printmaking as a art form different from drawing and painting. So let's start with the way that it's similar. One, printmaking is a two-dimensional form of making artwork. And so it's in general most similar to drawing in that it's generally kind of makes marks in a similar way to drawing, which is primarily through line and then building up a line to create tone and having other kind of methods for making tone. But printmaking can be in color, and so like certain kinds of printmaking actually feel like they're more like painting. So like screen printing definitely feels more like painting than it does like drawing. But the main difference about printmaking from drawing and painting is that drawing and painting are both ways of making two-dimensional artwork where you're working by hand and you're making a single image. You're working directly, meaning you're you're using your hand and the tool in your hand to put a mark on the piece of paper that makes the drawing. Whereas printmaking is all kinds of different processes where you work on some other kind of surface. Could be a wood block, it could be a metal plate. We call all those other kinds of surfaces the matrix, right? You work on some other kind of surface, you get that surface just right, and then you either like you apply ink to it or you press ink through it. You use some means by which you then take that thing that you've been working on and transfer its image to another piece of paper. And so built into the definition of printmaking is the idea of reproducibility. It doesn't mean that all printmaking involves making multiples, making like an addition of things where they are all exactly the same, but most printmaking does. Most printmaking involves someone um, you make let's say a wood block and then you make a series of prints from that wood block, right? And it's relief printmaking. Or you make an intaglio plate through etching. You make that plate, you ink it, you print it, you ink it, you print it, and every time if you ink it pretty much the same way and print it pretty much with the same pressure, it's going to print the same, and you can make boom, boom, boom. You can make 20 in a row that are all pretty much identical, right? So reproducibility is an important part of printmaking, but it's also important to remember that it's not that all printmaking involves reproducibility. There are certain kinds of printmaking where you pretty much only can make an edition of one or two or three. And then there are certain kinds of printmaking where people don't make editions. They make single one of a kind images. But in general, reproducibility is a major part of printmaking. Okay, so printmaking is different ways where and another thing about printmaking in general, but not always, is the use of a press, a mechanical machine which presses the plate or the block against the paper and makes the print, right? And part of part of my point here is that the explosion of printmaking, especially the Renaissance and post-Renaissance explosion of printmaking in Europe, was in large part connected to the advancement of the printing press for making text, right? Like letterpress printing for printing books led to more and more places having printing presses, and then more and more places allowing you to also print folios of pictures as well. And because printmaking and the history of printmaking is so tied to the history of the book and so tied to the printing history of the book, it means that a lot of prints are generally done at that kind of scale, at book scale. Many times they were made to be in books, or many times they were made to be in folios, which would be packets of paper that someone could hold, easily in their hand that they could have in a bag, not meant to be like, uh, 30 by 40 size works of art. Although there's also lots of examples of printmaking that is quite monumental in scale. So there's this is a intaglio printing press right there with a flywheel. And it's a good image to kind of give you a sense of what we're talking about. If we were taking this class in person, we would spend a day in the printmaking room, like actually making some prints and using the printing press. And so and that's kind of fun. But we don't get to do that because this is an online class. This is a summer class. But for those of you who will be on campus within the next year or next 2 years and are considering, think about that you could be an art minor and then you would have a chance to take a printmaking class. So there are four main types of printmaking in general. There are some things that kind of bleed from one thing to another, but the four main types are relief printmaking. All right, and actually, let's start with and of the four main types, there are two, relief and intaglio, that are older and kind of like they're the beginning part. So in a way, like fundamentally, 80% of printmaking out there in the world is either relief or intaglio type printmaking. But there are other types of printmaking. We'll get to those in a second. So relief printmaking is where you carve something, usually like a piece of wood or something soft, like a piece of linoleum, and you carve it in such a way that everywhere that you carve away is going to be the light areas. And everywhere that you leave, when you then roll a roller over it and ink it, that holds the ink. So the ink is basically on top surface, and everything that's cut in, so as you can see here, right, like all the deep cut surfaces have no ink, and then the ink is just rolled across the top. So the ink sits on that top surface. And so that's what prints. And intaglio is pretty much the exact opposite. Intaglio is where um, you have a metal plate and then you find some way of putting marks into that metal plate, like you scratch marks into it, like in dry point or engravings, or you use acid to cut deeper lines into it, like an etching. But you find some way of putting grooves into that plate, and then you ink it, and then you wipe it. And so when you wipe it, the ink stays in all the grooves and it's removed from the top layer. So it's exactly kind of like the opposite of relief in that it's all the places that you marked, all the places that you scratched away that then wind up holding the ink. So because with intaglio, it's generally metal plates and then the ink is caught in these tiny little cracks, then you need to use a much heavier pressure on your printmaking to press that ink out of the metal plate. Um, so so that's the difference between relief and intaglio. And then there are two other forms of printmaking. One that's called planographic, and there are some different kinds of planographic. The main idea for planographic printmaking is that the surface is not marked in any way, like it's not cut into in any way. You don't have grooves, you don't have large areas cut away. The surface is flat. And so the way you create places that have ink and places that don't have ink, you have to use other processes, basically more chemical-based processes, like in a lithograph. And we'll get to the lithograph in a little bit. And then lastly, you have stencil-based printmaking. So if you understand like what a stencil is, like if you took a letter stencil to a wall and then spray painted and you wrote out the word um, stem, right? There you go. That's using a stencil. So, whereas a screen print, like silk screen, a screen print uses that same principle where instead of the stencil being like a piece of paper, the stencil is built into the screen. And so the screen is like a very fine mesh, and the places that are blocked off prevent the ink from going through. And then the other places that aren't, even though it's all held together, because the mesh is so fine, the ink goes right through it. Okay, so those are the four main types of printmaking. We're going to start with relief printmaking. And so in relief printmaking, there are two main traditions that we're going to talk about. There is the tradition of um, woodcuts, the European tradition of doing woodcuts. Um, and that's where pretty much it's a single block and usually black and white. And then there's the Japanese tradition of woodblock printing, where it's using multiple blocks and you're also doing multiple colors. And some areas you're using gradations. But it is still fundamentally, the Japanese woodblock print is still a form of relief printmaking because there will be places that are carved away and places that are not. But then on top of that, in the Japanese system, like in these woodblock prints, there's much more careful control about like how areas are inked. So Albrecht Dürer was a master of European printmaking and of the woodcuts and relief printmaking. And here's a really great example. You can really see sort of the look. The thing about um, relief printmaking is that they're generally everything, all the conscious is built up of these rather kind of like bold sort of hatch lines all throughout. Another thing that you can kind of clearly see is that in general, because and up until like the 20th century when artists could work with linoleum, like what are called lino cuts, linoleum like the stuff that you have on your let's say your kitchen floor is much softer. It's a petroleum-based product and it can be carved away and carved in any number of directions. But wood generally carves in one set of directions better than others. And you can see here on this woodcut here that that the direction of the grain is a really important choice as to how the whole picture is organized. So, speaking of Dürer, we're going to use Dürer to transition into other forms of intaglio printmaking because Dürer was one of those masters who was both, and he did work with also with master printers, but he made master prints in relief printmaking, but also in intaglio printmaking, and in multiple forms of intaglio printmaking, including engraving, like these two prints right here. And by the way, this print here, The Knight and the Devil, we are going to see multiple times. It will probably come up as one of our contrast images for tests. It'll probably be in your value contrast question on the final exam. And one of the reasons why we talk about it is the way the value is created entirely out of repetition of lines in this print. I wish I had, unfortunately, that's in another lecture where I have a zoom in on it so you can see all the lines. Okay, so both of these are engravings. Now, the thing about engravings is that there is the simplest form of intaglio printmaking is what's called dry point. And dry point is where you scratch in lines with a tool, like a stylus or a burin tool to scratch away those lines. And that tool, it's like a thin metal point, it winds up making not only the line, but the line has a burr, like this little extra raised bit of metal along the edges of the line. And it's really the burr that winds up holding most of the ink. So that's great in some ways because the burr does at first it's really good at holding ink. It's bad long term uh, because that burr starts to get wiped away every time you print it, every time you run it through the press, that kind of diminishes how much of that burr is there. And so you can't really make very large additions in dry point. Engraving is where you use a much sharper and much more heavy duty tool, and you gouge out by hand lines into the copper plate. And it requires some serious strength and precision and energy. But Durer also mastered etching as well. And so etching is different from an engraving. They might at times look almost exactly the same, but it's different fundamentally because in an etching, your physical body doesn't have to do the hard work of cutting those lines. Instead, the acid cuts the lines. So let me explain the basic process. So the process is you have a plate. Imagine that this plate originally was completely blank, didn't have any drawing on it whatsoever. And then you cover the whole plate with a kind of a brown rubberish material called a ground. And you cover that whole plate with this ground. And the ground is kind of like rubbery. And when it's hot, it's like molten rubbery. And you cover the whole thing and then it dries and it's hard. Okay. And then you can scratch away at that rubber with your metal tools. And everywhere that you scratch away, even the thinnest and finest of lines, everywhere you scratch away, right, the metal will be exposed. Then what you do is you then take that plate and you put it in an acid bath. And so the ground protects the plate everywhere that the ground is, the acid doesn't start to cut into the plate. But everywhere that the ground has been cut away by you drawing thin lines in it, then it starts to cut deep lines into that plate. So you just have to put like a thin little line, and then it will wind up doing the hard work of making that line a deep groove that will really hold ink for a long time. And so here we have an example by Durer, and here we have an example by Rembrandt. And with Rembrandt, he was very good at what is called over and under wiping. So that he used like so he overwiped in some areas and underwiped in others to create more atmosphere. Generally, this is quite frowned upon in the printmaking world because most of the people who try to do it, they can't possibly be consistent enough to do it well and do it the exact same way each time. But Rembrandt was quite skilled as a painter, and so he was actually very good at playing with his underwiping and his overwiping in such a way to really make the images extra dramatic and extra, you know, rich and have a lot of atmosphere. So here's some examples. One of the things about an etching is because generally artists work where they cut in grooves and then they remove the ground, then they might put a new ground on, or they might continue to work on the same old ground, but they'll basically like put it in the acid bath and then work on it some more, then put it in the acid bath and work on it some more. And the result of that is that you can kind of like completely change your ideas. So um, here we have three stages of this idea of Christ being presented to the people. And in the first stage, there's just a crowd of people here in the front, and it looks a little bit kind of piddly. It doesn't look like all that impressive. And then he thought, well, what if we didn't, what if there wasn't room for the crowds to stand right in the center? That might make, actually, in a way, make the compressed crowds on either side feel a little bit more impressive. And then it occurred to him to add like that we get this view of the prison, like the underground prison windows from this angle. So we're kind of like looking down into the dungeon cells. And that both, heightens the drama and that it like gives a sense of like, oh, that's Jesus was probably kept down there before he was brought up to be brought in front of the people and then sent to crucifixion. So there adds that kind of drama, but also adds the drama of like there's a reason now why there's no one in this space, and there's a sense of like these people might fall. They're all compressed so far, and it kind of makes the crowd, even though now there are fewer people here than what he had here, it makes the crowd feel bigger and more intense. So, one of the things that I talk about in this lecture about printmaking is the search for tone. One of the things you might notice is that when we got to engravings and we got to and we got to etchings, that there is a lot of tone being created here, but all of this tone has to be created out of line work. And so, and there's a sense of like that kind of depends on the quality of the line artist, right? The person who's putting those lines down. If if they're not all that skilled, those lines can look really kind of artificial. And so artists and technicians who are trying to help the artist had been aiming for ways of making pure tone in printmaking. And mezzotint was one of the processes that came out of that. So mezzotint is technically um, it's a form of a dry point. And the reason is because it, like dry point, it depends on the burrs, not the actual carved in lines, but the burrs to be the thing that primarily holds the ink. And so um, dry point, like dry point, you can't get very large additions, maybe an addition of 10, maybe 12, depends on how you do it. And the basic process is you start with a plate that's already been rocked, right? Or you get a plate and you rock it yourself until the entire plate is completely thoroughly rocked and so that it's completely, so it would print pure black. Now you're asking me, like, what do you mean, like it's already been rocked? Okay, let's go back to the beginning here. So you have a plate, and then you have this tool that looks a little bit like a cowbell, right? Only also it kind of looks like a little bit like a rocking chair. Okay, and it's got a handle like a cowbell. And then on the underside where it's curved and where it can rock back and forth, it has all these fine little teeth that cut little grooves into the plate. And you basically rock over this plate back and forth, just cutting grooves and cutting grooves and cutting grooves over and over again until you've completely covered the plate with as many tiny little cuts into the plate and tiny little burrs on the plate as possible. And it's like super rough, like if you run your finger over it. And if you inked it, like I said, it would print just about close to pure black. Then what the artist can do is then they come back in and they start working with sandpaper to lighten areas. The more you sand, the more you're reducing the burrs, and then the less ink those areas will hold. You sand a little bit less, right? Like up there, or the light back here, right? It might hold a little bit more ink. You sand a little bit less than that. It holds a little bit more ink, a little bit less than that, a little bit more ink. And you can have all these really subtle shifts. As long as the artist is good at really controlling how much they basically erase their burrs using their sandpaper. Okay, so that's a mezzotint. An aquatint, which sounds very similar, is quite different. So like with a mezzotint, you start with one single dark tone, and then with sandpaper, you just start removing it in slight amounts, kind of working the same way you might work with an eraser working into a charcoal drawing. In aquatint, you have to do all your tones in sections. And the way aquatint works is if well, let's go back for a second um, to etchings for a second. If you remember when I described etchings, I said that you put down a ground, right? And the ground is this rubbery material, and that it's very fluid when it's heated up, but then when it dries, it's hard. Well, someone figured out, wait a second, we could take that ground and grind the ground, right? Grind it up into a dust, into the finest dust particles we could make. And then we could sprinkle those dust particles over the top surface of the plate. And like we could sprinkle them really evenly, like using, have you ever seen like a powdered sugar sprinkler, like for bakeries, and how it evenly sifts and spreads out the powdered sugar over the surface? You could do the same thing with this powdered ground. And now it's on the plate in little tiny specks of dust. And then you then heat up the plate until it's quite hot. And every one of those little specks of dust, that is also a little piece of rubber, then starts to melt, becomes a little tiny droplet of molten rubber on the surface of the plate. And then you cool it down, and then they stick to the plate. Okay. So now, when you go and bring that plate to the acid bath, all the gaps between those little sprinkled dots, all those gaps in between become places where the acid cuts lines. And so depending on how much you sprinkle just a little bit, it's going to be a darker area. You sprinkle a lot, it'll be a lighter area. And so you can then make different kinds of degrees of tone, right? As you can see here, like you have areas of one kind of tone and then areas of another kind of tone, and then areas of a really, really dark tone. And it's just in these series. And oftentimes there might be an addition of some dry point or even engraving on top and of the process with the aquatint, but that's aquatint. And so another method for printmaking that allows for a softer kind of tone is lithography. Lithography was not particularly invented for the purpose of making tone. It was just one of the byproducts of after people figured out how to how to do lithography. The story of how lithography was invented is actually kind of interesting. The inventor of the lithograph was actually working on a way, trying to come up with a new way to do sheet music, to do printed sheet music that would be efficient. Because at the time they didn't have like a good printing press system for printing sheet music, and so he was coming up with like, well, maybe there's a way we could just reproduce by hand, right? And so he was experimenting with all kinds of different materials, but he was off to go do some other job. And he had all these materials lying around. And he's leaving his apartment, but he knows that his cleaning ladies can be coming by later in the day to pick up the laundry. And he doesn't have, like a piece of paper. So he writes using like a grease crayon on this piece of limestone that he has lying in his room that he's using as a doorstop. He writes on the doorstop made out of limestone his laundry list. And then later, because of some accident involving some water, involving some ink, later he accidentally sees that part of that list gets printed onto a piece of paper. And so, and he realizes that you can use this process to make reproducible images. So the way the process works, you have like this stone, and the stone by its nature, because of like limestone, water tends to beat up on it. So then you draw with a grease tool, right? And then you after you draw with the grease tool, you wet the whole surface. You spritz it with water or you dampen it in some other way. So the whole surface is wet. And then you roll the ink over the whole surface. And because everywhere that you haven't, everywhere that you drew or everywhere that you left the stone, right, alone, water's beat up on it. And so when you roll your oil-based ink over it, the ink doesn't stick to the stone at all, right? It just rolls right over the water. The water repels it, right? Because of the way water and oil work. But everywhere that you come across that grease marker, right, it pushes the water out of the way enough, and then the ink sticks to the grease of the grease marker. So then you then can remove the water mostly, and then lay paper down and press that paper into that stone block, and it will reproduce the image exactly. Nowadays, we actually use metal plates instead, and there's a way to chemically treat the metal plates so that they react to the water in the same way that a linoleum stone does. But it's the principle is basically the same. So lithography, one of the great things about lithography is it allows an artist to really reproduce their drawing hand. Like one of the things about, let's say the worst example of this would probably be engraving, right? But dry point is also like the thing about like scratching into a metal plate, especially if you had to cut a really deep groove, is it's really hard to have a very free flowing hand, right? Have a loose gestural hand because you're cutting so slowly and carefully and tight. And so um, it's hard. It's a little bit easier. Like you can see a certain gesturalness in Rembrandt the way, but it's really only in these thin lines that Rembrandt can be really kind of loose and gestural. But in lithography, you every line and every amount of tone and every subtlety can be as loose, and it can be like as much of a just an exact reproduction of that kind of fluid gesturalness that was made in the initial mark. So lithography immediately became, for those artists that were great draftsmen that really loved to draw, lithography became um, a new love because it was a way to make reproducible artwork from and keep those qualities. Okay. Is there anything else I want to say about lithography? I think that's so you can do color lithography, and color lithography was extremely important in the development of illustration and graphic design in especially in Paris at the turn of the century, right? This period is extremely um, important in kind of like setting ideas about style. And lastly, I want to talk about screen printing. So screen printing is where you work basically like a stencil. A you have a screen. Originally, the screen was made out of silk, but now it's probably a type of nylon. Um, and it's a very, very thin, sheer material, and so has a lot of space in the holes and very fine material. And then there are different ways that you can, like the simplest way would be to just kind of block off areas with like wax, right? But or with paper stencils where you like just literally kind of like glue down paper stencils to block off these areas are going to get ink, these areas are not going to get ink. But there are other kinds of ways, photo-based ways where you can do a photo impression on the screen and and um, make a screen that's basically a photo reproduction. That's what like Andy Warhol was doing here. And so, and screen printing, one of the great things about screen printing is you can do a lot of colors. Like in, let me think. In I don't know, like I think in our department, probably the most I've ever seen a student do was like a print doing about 25 colors, right? Where you could really layer the colors a little bit and you could just have a lot of different colors in a single image. And another thing that's great about screen printing is that you can have really large editions. The only when you're doing photo based, like especially if you're doing like CMYK, which where you're using a color for, cyan, magenta, yellow, and black, right? When you're doing like CMYK screen printing, you might have this thing called dot fill that where the dot 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 quality images gets filled up over time, and that might limit your edition. But screen printings generally, you can make editions of 30 or 50 pretty easily. And so there are a couple other points I didn't really cover here, just seeing if there's a page where I should have covered it. So one thing that I didn't cover was the definition of an edition. So an edition, as in edition, right? An edition is a set of prints that are all deemed by the artist to be as close as possible to being the same, and so they consider them a set that can be sold and all be considered of the same value. And generally, the way artists will do this is they will do an edition number, right? So like let's say you made a bunch of prints and let's say it was a relief print and you made 20 of them. And then you looked over them and you said, of these 20, I think 16 are all pretty much the same and all really what I was going for. So you cut out the other four. You might call those edition variables or artist proofs or something else. But you don't call them part of the edition. You don't charge the same price for them. And then those 16 that you say these are the edition, you number them. You go from, and so the first one is one out of 16. So like a fraction, 1/16, then 2/16, then 3/16, then 4 out of 16, 5 out of 16, all the way to 16 out of 16. And that way each print has an edition number, and each edition number tells the person not only which number one they got, but also how many total are in the edition, which is the most important information because that's basically telling the owner how valuable this print is. There were only 16 of these. That makes them very worthwhile. Um, so that's an edition. And then another term that I didn't cover in the lecture that I should have covered along the way was the term registration. When when you're doing any kind of printmaking where you have multiple blocks and to do multiple colors and that they have to find a way to all line up, that's called registration. And so registration is the effort to make sure that like your multiple layers of your print, whether it's multiple values or multiple colors, trying to find here's some color examples, that they line up with each other and they don't kind of like overlap in weird ways. You can see like you can see some slight kind of overlaps that happen sometimes in like the Warhol prints that show you a little bit of a hitch in some of the registration issues. And so related to registration, there is a form of relief printmaking called a reductive print. And that's where, like, it's really hard. Like, the Japanese wood blocks are amazing because it's really hard to do relief prints where you're using multiple blocks and you get to keep them all aligned all the way through the process. It is just very technically challenging. So, another way to do this is to do multiple colors on a single block where you start first and you carve everything that's going to be your lightest light, and then you ink it with and that would be the light of whatever the color of the paper is. So let's say the paper is white. You carve away everything that's going to be pure white. And then you ink everything else and then print that to be your next darkest color. Let's say kind of a creamy, kind of yellow ochre sort of color, like that color. And then you carve it some more. And then you print your next darkest color, right? Like let's say it might be an orange or a green. And then again, and this time it might be the next darkest color, like maybe a slightly darker red. And then again, and now it might be a next darkest color, maybe a darker brown. And then again, all the way to like our very darkest color, it might be like a dark, dark blue. And then our last darkest color might be a black, right? And by the time you're printing that black, it might be everything is carved away except for like some thin lines here and there and like some few tiny little spots where pure black is going to show up. And that's called the reductive printing, that you're continually reducing the amount of surface of the block all the way through the process. Okay, I think that covers all of printmaking, and I went a little bit long. So, but I just wanted to say, so the next lecture will be on perspective and pictorial space. And this will be somewhat related to the fact that we just talked about printmaking, but also because, well, we need to get to it eventually. I could have done this in the Renaissance lecture, but if we can also do it here. And we talk about the difference between isometric and linear perspective and things like that. And and then the last lecture is this fun kind of little lecture. It's not a very long one, just about the kind of just getting an overview of how artists are kind of interested in studying things as part of the process of making art. Like that making art involves a lot of studying the visual world. Okay. All right. That's the end. And I will see some of you later.